lot of junk food. And that I've clearly seen the triglycerides spikes up. But going back to what I was saying before, this was not low total fat at all. Many days I had over 100 grams of total fat. And so it's not something that I think has to be restrictive. And again, I don't think I can get on board with saying don't even manipulate with your diet at all. What's up, guys? So today we are going to talk about an experiment that I've been running for almost 1 year now. I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, and it's kind of a good thing that it's been delayed because I've been able to gather more and more data. You're going to see me talk about this in an upcoming podcast as well, and we're going to discuss what I did and the effect it had on my health, and particularly my cholesterol panel, my lipid panel, and what was done. So starting back in February of 2024, I wanted to see how dietary manipulation affected primarily my LDL. So my LDL-C, my LDL cholesterol, I wanted to see how that was affected. Now, typically people think of this as the quote unquote bad cholesterol, and we know that there's some flaws with that thinking, but generally people think of HDL as positive or protective and LDL as being problematic, high LDL correlating with risk of heart disease, atherosclerosis, and ultimately worse longevity. And so most people do focus on that. A lot of people like Peter Attia and Rhonda Patrick have popularized that it's actually not really LDL specifically, but ApoB, and it's actually more appropriate to measure ApoB. There's a million videos out there on that. And I wanted to see if I could manipulate that from a dietary standpoint. So this video is basically going to go along with that assumption. And I would say there is a lot of proof to suggest that LDL is a causative factor for heart disease, and it is something that most people would benefit from having lower. I understand that there are carnivore camps and other camps that say that LDL is protective and we want to have that. The preponderance of evidence certainly suggests otherwise and suggests that lower LDL is beneficial and is likely to result in less risk of heart disease as one gets older. Again, a lot of videos out there, so I'm not going to get too much today into whether or not it is a cause of heart disease, and again, specifically atherosclerosis, but it is something that I just want to put out there, and that is why we are discussing it for this video. Now, historically, I've done a ketogenic diet numerous times, and I even did a brief stint with a carnivore diet just to see how it affected me. And not too surprisingly, I was somebody they call a lean mass hyperresponder. So I had a very dramatic response to my cholesterol levels. When I was on a ketogenic diet, my total cholesterol was close to 300, with my LDL in the low 200s. When I was on a carnivore diet, my total cholesterol was in the 400s, with my LDL in the 300s. So dramatic response there. And so we are going to talk about if I was able to see the opposite when manipulating my diet in the other direction. And so what I wanted to do was have saturated fat at under 15 grams per day for 2 months, and then I would test. So basically, at the end of my previous time bulking up to about 215 pounds, I saw that my LDL hit about 140 to 145, which was, other than during those ketogenic and carnivore experiments, one of the highest it's ever been. Basically, the highest I had seen it during a normal period of diet. And I certainly was not comfortable having it there long term. Frankly, it's been somewhere between 110 and 130 for a while. And even that, I've questioned if I would really be comfortable having it at that level for an extended period of time. And so I wanted to see if I could get that down with diet. And so again, less than 15 grams of saturated fat per day, every day, no cheats. And the reality is I was probably averaging closer to about 10 grams of saturated fat per day. Now, bear in mind, this was not a low-fat diet. This was the very beginning of my cutting period, right? So I wanted to cut down from 215, which is certainly a confounder, but I didn't want to cut much weight because I didn't want much of a confounding variable there. And so I did my best to maintain weight, but if anybody remembers from about a year ago, I got very sick with strep and flu. I really never get sick, so this was very unusual for me. And so this was a particularly difficult experiment because I wanted to stay true to the experiment, but I was very sick. I went to the ER twice during this time, and yet I still stuck to the experiment, and I made sure to eat still 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day with less than 15 grams of saturated fat per day, doing this in order to stay true to the experiment. So at least there was some dedication there, but very difficult during that period for sure. After this period, I decided to say, okay, well, what's realistic? Is it realistic that I'm going to have no saturated fat? And again, for the sake of this video, I'm gonna count my under 15 grams of saturated fat per day days as a no saturated fat day. So if you hear me say no saturated fat, that's what I mean. A day or period, less than 15 grams of saturated fat per day. But going back to what I was saying before, this was not low total fat at all. Many days I had over 100 grams of total fat, but was still able to keep saturated fat under 15 grams a day. Certainly restrictive. You have to be very cognizant of what you're eating when doing this, and it is limiting. So after that 2 months, I said, okay, I'm going to try it with one cheat per week. And what that means is one meal per week that I'm allowing to have higher saturated fat. So 6 days of the week, still quote unquote no saturated fat, and then one day where I do allow higher saturated fat. And for example, the first time I did this, I hosted a UFC party. And during that time, I had a lot of pizza and wings and all of that. And then I had no more saturated fat, and I measured 2 weeks after that. And so we're gonna discuss those results. And then I went another 2 months where I was allowing one saturated fat cheat per week. So basically, first set of results, no saturated fat at all for 2 weeks, again, under 15 grams a day for, 2 months. And then I had the cheat. 2 weeks later, again, no saturated fat, tested again, and then 2 months of once per week saturated fat, which I felt would be much more realistic because I'm probably not gonna go the rest of my life eating very low saturated fat every single day and never allowing any sort of cheating or anything like that. Again, I just use the term cheat. You could say free meal, whatever you want to call it. One meal that was off the standard plan. And so what I'm going to do is just read the numbers for you guys from these experiments. And I'm going to go into the implications that this might have and what I take away from it, what I might be doing going forward. So January 5th of 2024, before the experiment started, I was at 143. So that was my LDL at that time. And again, that was 143 milligrams per deciliter. After doing this for a couple of months, I was at 67 for my LDL, which is a dramatic change. But to me, that does make sense because I eat a high fiber diet. I was still doing all my normal exercising. Again, there's debate as to how much exercise can really change cholesterol levels, but more so the fact that I had this hyper response when I was on a high saturated fat diet, carnivore or ketogenic diet, that brought my LDL up dramatically. So it seems like I am able to manipulate it in both directions. 67 is very low for no medication at all. Very few people have levels that low unless they are a vegan and they're really cognizant of their diet. Most people are not going to have that naturally. And so to bring that low, I was very happy to see that. Kind of surprised that it dropped that much. Most people, if you saw, if there was a study out there showing that this medication, which there are these medications and studies that show that somebody went from 143 to 67, that is fantastic. And so I was very happy to see that. However, I mentioned that I had a big cheat at that party. I had a big cheat, and then 2 weeks later, so nothing else other than that cheat, 2 weeks later tested, and it went from 67 to 81. Now again, it is important to understand that there are going to be variations with these numbers. If I got it tested a day after that 67, maybe it would have been 63, maybe it would have been 75. There's going to be variations, and so these are single time points, and I'm not saying that it clearly, specifically increased it by 14 points. From one test to the next, it did, but again, even within a test, there's variability, and so it's just something to keep in mind. After doing one cheat per week for a few months, I then went from 81 up to 94. I tested it again and I was 91. And then I wanted to do one other experiment. So after being on that diet for a while, I had a long vacation. And so I had more or less 5 or 6 days of eating whatever I wanted. So LDL obviously and cholesterol panel in general is going to change with diet, but it's not an immediate change. And so just for reference, after being at 91, after 5 to 6 days of eating kind of whatever I wanted, LDL went up to 106 with high triglycerides. So during this entire time, I always had low triglycerides, including on carnivore diet, including on a ketogenic diet, low triglycerides. The only time I've had high triglycerides is when I have been eating a lot of junk food, and that I've clearly seen the triglycerides spikes up. So even though this was actually, there was one kind of washout day of healthy eating before this blood work, still high triglycerides, and again, as expected, given what I was eating. And then finally, I did another further experiment, 2 saturated fat meals per week, and this brought me up, after a couple of months of that, 297. So if we look at this in total, we see basically this, that I was close to around 70 milligrams per deciliter if I have no saturated fat. 2 weeks after that, low 80s, one saturated fat meal per week, maybe low 90s, and if I allow 2 saturated fat meals per week, maybe upper 90s to 100. So we see that I can clearly manipulate it with diet, but that is also very restrictive. And so what do we do with that information? Well, I would say that one thing is that it made it easier to diet. I mentioned it was very difficult to kind of postpone my cut because it's hard to eat as much with this kind of diet. The reality is, if you're not having full fat cheeses and higher fat meats, it's just more difficult. Sure, you can put on olive oil and whatnot, not quite the same. And so I had fat-free cheeses, lean meats, obviously lots of fruits and vegetables and whatnot. And so that can make it more difficult to eat. Now I will say, you could say, hey, was there a confounder here? Did you have more fiber? I tracked that and I mostly was eating the same amount of fiber and I always was eating a lot of vegetables anyway, but I can't say that it was exactly the same, even though I do log everything I eat, pretty much down to the gram. Still, there can be some variation there, and it's not like I went through every single day and tracked the exact amount, but generally the pattern was the same. So what I would say is that if you want to lower your LDL, your ApoB, I think diet is absolutely a feasible way for many people to do this. I was kind of surprised to hear Peter Attia recently say that in this day and age, there is just no reason for any dietary manipulation when we have the medications that we have. I understand that Peter is very big on PCSK9 inhibitors. There's also other options like ezetimibe, bempedoic acid. Obviously, statins are the first line for many people. And it's usually not until the statins alone are not sufficient that they go to other medications, either adding them to the statins or just replacing the statins depending on the reason the statins are not working for them. And he also acknowledges that statins have side effects. I mean, maybe he back up on that a little bit and say, okay, there's some minor side effects. It's still something that I would say, if you can do it without medication, is there a reason to do it? And there's arguments. I mean, there's a whole moral argument to it. There's a financial argument to it, and just a structure of the medical system argument to it. And that's certainly not what this video is for. But to me, to say that there's no reason to manipulate your diet for that purpose, to me, I don't personally agree with that. I'm not saying that you should drastically change your life because, like I said, this is certainly somewhat limiting. But even if it was a hybrid method where you said, hey, you know what? I'm going to go on a low dose of medications and also manipulate my diet so I'm not having super high saturated fats. For example, he's also talked about how there is a risk of too low of fat. But as I mentioned before, you don't have to have low fat to have low saturated fat. I was still often having 80 to 100 grams of fat every single day, a ton of monounsaturated fats, a lot of polyunsaturated fats, a wide variety of different foods. And I certainly was not deficient in any micronutrients. And even just going on the chronometer, I could see that I was pretty much hitting everything every day, sometimes way above the recommended daily amounts. And so it's not something that I think has to be restrictive. And again, I don't think I can get on board with saying don't even manipulate with your diet at all. Maybe my view on that will change in the future, but as of now, I would say that I would recommend, and again, the evidence certainly suggests eating a lower saturated fat diet. Certainly some will say, hey, high LDL doesn't matter if you've got high HDL, low triglycerides, low inflammation, and maybe it's necessary but not sufficient, but if you don't have these other things, it's not problematic. There's a lot to be said there. Again, this would be a much, much longer video if we went into all of that. All I will say is that the vast majority of evidence shows that it is beneficial to one's health to keep saturated fat lower. It is something I would recommend. And whether or not it's specifically for you to be able to lower LDL absent of other medications, that's something for you to decide for yourself. But to me, I would say that it would be more beneficial to have less saturated fat and a lower LDL. And again, discussing what can be done about this, that is going to bring us to the last part of this video. More and more, there is a recognition that it may be very beneficial to have LDL below 60 to 70 milligrams per deciliter. Some advocate even lower than that. Some people are able to be there naturally, meaning even without dietary manipulation, but most are not. And so I am going to experiment with a low dose of rosuvastatin. Rosuvastatin is one of the more potent statins, and typical doses are 5, 10, 20, 40 milligrams. Many people see a reduction of LDL 30 to 40%, some even closer to 50% reduction with rosuvastatin doses. I've talked to a number of cardiologists, some who are my own patients, some who I've just seen, some who I've become friends with, who have also told me that they are taking low-dose rosuvastatin for this same reason. even though they didn't have very high LDL to begin with. One thing I like about this is that it doesn't have to be this forever thing, and we can just try it, see if there are noticeable side effects. If there are, you always have the option to come off. But what I plan on doing is still having that diet manipulation. So I'm not just gonna say, hey, I'm on a low dose statin, so I'm just gonna eat crap all day, or even just healthy food that happens to be higher in saturated fat. I'm still going to have very low saturated fat with 1 to 2 meals per week that are higher in saturated fat. That, I think, is going to allow myself to be more social and not have to only eat these low saturated fat foods all the time. I don't think it's something that I would really want to do, to just never have any of that. And 1 to 2 a week, I think, allows for a nice balance. That, from my past blood work, has shown to have me in the upper 80s to low 90s. And I think that's fine. And I'm interested to see if a very low dose of rosuvastatin at 2.5 milligrams per day can get me sub 70. That would be fantastic. That is lower than even the lowest dose that's typically prescribed. And so I want to start there and see what happens. And I will get blood work after that, and I will report back for those who are interested, and I can tell you how it's going. I don't think that you're really going to see any significant changes one way or the other than what's on the blood work. The hope is that this reduces the risk over 10, 20, 30 years, not that there's going to be some immediate change. But again, I think the evidence suggests that that makes a lot of sense. So guys, that is the video. Let me know what you think of that experiment. Let me know if you have tried to experiment either with carnivore, keto, very low saturated fat, vegan, and what you noticed with your lipid panels, how you felt on it. If you have any questions about statins or your experience, post it below. Certainly online, you hear a lot of these horror stories, but again, the vast majority of people do not have side effects from them. I know many, many people who are on statins. The vast majority tolerate it very well, but I'm not pro or anti-statin. That is just what the evidence seems to suggest, and I will certainly report back with this next experiment. So guys, wanting to make this for a while, that's it. Comment down below, subscribe for more, and I will see you next time.